Hello! So, today I'm talking about a bit of a smaller chunk of the book than usual. Usually, I've been doing this series in sort of 7 chapter chunks mostly, because that sort of felt like a natural, good size to talk about. But I need to talk about uh, the stuff going on in this smaller set of chapters because there is already so much I want to talk about, and I already don't know how I'm going to talk about all of it. Um, so I guess I'll just go chronologically. Um, so, at the start of this chapter, we finally get what the book has been sort of building up towards this whole time, which is meeting Kinrove, this character who has been foreshadowed so extensively at this point, that and so much has been sort of built up about him, and it begins with an incredibly well executed but also very standard and sort of tropey sort of villain introduction. Navare and Olikea arrive at his camp. They find that the camp is very magically protected. There's a great show of force when Kinrove um, both shows off this magical force field he's built around the camp and then also quick walks them all the way to the camp from a great distance. Essentially just showing off how much more powerful he is than Soldier's Boy at this point, in terms of magic. And then Navarre passes through the dancers, who are not explained at this point, but we can clearly tell that something very, very dark and fucked up is happening with all of these dancing people. Like, it's very explicit that this is not a. These people are not having a good time, and yet they're dancing eternally. Something horrible is happening here. And then we get in and we see this tableau perfectly designed both by Kinrove in universe and by Hobb, uh, in a sort of Doylean sense, um, to demonstrate that Kinrove is the most powerful person here. Everything is about emphasizing his size and his power. He's above everyone else, um, and and there's Daisy, this new character, a seemingly irrelevant great one, certainly no more important, uh, it seems, than someone like Jadoli, just another of the probably many great ones that the specs have. Nothing much to note there. And what Hobb does here was such a brilliant plot twist because it feels like it was written with sort of genre tropes in mind. Because if you've read a lot of genre fiction, if you've read a lot of fantasy, you will have read this scene before, or at least something that this scene seems like it's going to be until it suddenly isn't. You've read the scene where the heroes enter the villain's lair and they see this grandiose display of power from the villain, and there's also some lesser characters there who are maybe powerful in their own right, like maybe some lords or something who serve the main bad guy, and then we see a demonstration of the main ruler's power when he sort of brutally punishes or maybe even kills, or just casually dismisses this lesser threat in his midst. Um, and, uh, Kinrove isn't necessarily uh, a villain, but he is very much set up like one at this point. It seems like, to me as the reader, as I'm reading this, that Kinrove is going to be sort of a major antagonist, at least, if not villain, for Navare and Soldier's Boy, at least for this act of the book. And everything is going exactly as I expected. Daisy stands up to him, he shuts her down, and I'm expecting the chapter to end with her going too far and him sort of brutally punishing her, either killing her, or more likely, given the sort of relationship that great ones have, like banishing her and publicly embarrassing her in some spectacular way just to show off his power, and then we'd never see her again. And instead, she wins. We've spent all this time building up Kinrove, and then we meet him, and immediately this character who was just introduced for the first time topples him from his throne and takes over, basically, with this wild gambit using iron, uh, which isn't even her being particularly clever or showing off any particular power or anything. It's just her showing dedication, showing that she is willing to go that far to get what she wants. And it's brilliantly executed. Um, so I wanted to start by saying that, like, my main impression from those two chapters in Kinrove's Stent is just how incredibly well executed the plot twist of Daisy's takeover was. That being said, though, what's more important here is why she took over, which is the revelation of the dance. So, we've sort of had hints from characters that Kinrove's methods for dealing with the Garnians are taking a heavy toll on the specs. Like, characters have mentioned that. I believe Jodoli has mentioned that. Certainly Oliker has mentioned it. I assumed that this was referring to the plague. I assumed that what they meant was that every time they go and do the dust dance and cause the plague to happen to the Girnians, specs also get sick and die. Which is true. I mean, that is a cost that they're paying. We've seen that already in the first two books. What didn't occur to me was that Kinrove's method is actually not just the plague, but also the Geddes sweat, the sense of fear and anxiety and despair that permeates both Geddes itself and the road as it's being built into the forest. And basically, that sense of despair and fear is being caused by an endless conga line of dancers who dance 24/7, literally until they drop dead, because they are magically compelled to do so. And as they dance, they have to feel the fear and anxiety and despair that they want to induce in others. So a whole bunch of specs are essentially not just being sacrificed, but being sacrificed in a horrific fashion. It's like a truly horrible death, where for the weeks or months or even seasons until they die, because it takes a while for them to dance themselves to death, they are constantly feeling some of the worst feelings a human can feel. It's a nightmare. It's one of the most horrific things I've read in this series, and this series has not shied away from horrible things, but this really sort of it made me instantly side with Daisy. I think I'm not supposed to like Daisy necessarily. I get the feeling that Daisy is being built up as a bit of an antagonist, especially based on what happens after this, which I'll get to. But honestly, no. I'm with Daisy. I think that, I mean, I agree with everyone else's criticism of her plan for dealing with the Guardians. I agree that that wouldn't work. But it would be better than this. This is not worth it. If I personally think, if I were in the position that the specs were in, if my choices were between essentially letting my culture disappear, letting my people stop existing as their own independent entity and be conquered and colonized, as horrible as that is, if my choices were between that and doing this to my people, I think I would go with the former. Obviously, I've never been in a position to have to make that choice, but I this feels like a the ones who walk away from Omelas situation to me. If you're familiar with that story, you'll know what I mean. Like, I don't think if the survival of your society requires this level of suffering, it's just not worth it. You just don't get to survive, in my opinion, if that's what it takes. But thankfully, I don't think that's what it takes. I'm not here suggesting that the specs should give up. I am, in fact, very much on Soldier Boy's side with his solution. Um, and what ultimately happens here is that Daisy breaks Kinro's dance, thereby ending his approach. And she also breaks his power in the sense that she essentially establishes herself as being much more of a leader within spec society than he is. Um, and then Soldier's Boy saves his life from Daisy by finally revealing what his plan is. And it's not as much of a. I'm kind of surprised by Navarre here, because Navarre was shocked by this. Like, Navarre acted like he didn't know what Soldier's Boy's plans were, and like obviously he didn't, but he could have guessed. It's a fairly straightforward plan. Navarre himself had thought of it at times. Uh, Basically, Soldier's Boy wants to do a genocide of Geddes, like completely wipe Geddes off the map. Um, and do so in a very direct military fashion, like show up as an army of specs and kill everyone and burn Geddes to the ground. And then use that to position the specs for future negotiations with Gyrnia. And while it's a brutal plan, and I fully understand Navarre's moral misgivings, um, and I certainly share them. I would not be able to do this. I do agree with Soldier's Boy that from a strictly utilitarian perspective, this might be the best. Like, in terms of if this works, and I think it has a decent chance to work, it's actually not a bad plan, but if it works, I think it's probably the outcome that leads to the least amount of death and suffering in the long run. Because letting the Gyrnians win obviously leads to conquest and colonization and probably generations of suffering and the death of an entire culture. Not to mention the deaths of all the immortals in the trees. So that's obviously much worse than the death of a single town. And continuing as we've been going so far, probably also ultimately leads to that same outcome, but also involves the continued suffering and death of Kinro's dancers. So that's an even worse outcome. So, of the options that have been presented so far, Soldier's Boys is the least terrible. I emphasize least terrible. It's still terrible, but there aren't any better options right now. At least not options that have occurred to our characters. I still think that Navarre should dreamwalk to the Queen. That strikes me as sort of a, an obvious thing to at least attempt, but that seems to not be on his mind right now. So who knows? But yeah, that's where we're at right now. That's the plan that's being hatched between Daisy, Soldier's Boy and I guess Kinrove, but he's very much not involved in their planning at the moment. But I've skipped something here. What I've skipped is that we actually have a 3-month time skip, because right after Soldier's Boy reveals his plans, Nivare attempts to rebel against his control of their shared body, and Soldier's Boy does something that Nivare refers to as boxing Nivare. Essentially, he isolates Nivare's consciousness inside his own mind and seals Nivare off from all ability to interact with the outside world, but also to perceive the outside world. Essentially, Nivare is just a floating consciousness. No sight, sound, touch, taste, smell. No ability to know what's happening, no ability to even feel the passage of time. And it's like solitary confinement, but even worse than that, because you don't even have like the very limited sensory information that you can have in a solitary confinement cell. It's complete sensory deprivation for 3 months straight. And I feel like the book kind of undersells the severity of this. Like, I feel like Nivare should be broken by the end of this. But he recovers fairly quickly, which I'm just not sure I buy. I feel like an experience like that, 3 months of complete sensory deprivation, would make him he'd come out of that gibbering. Like, I don't know, I feel like I'm not fully sold on the idea that just imagining his beautiful future with Amzil and her children was enough to keep him remotely sane through this process. But that's a minor nitpick, because it does do an important bit of narrative work, which is that it gets us this 3-month time skip. And the 3-month time skip is important because it lets us see what Soldier's Boy does without Nivare. This is really the first time we've had that. We've only seen Soldier's Boy in action when he is sort of tempered by Nivare. And now, sort of without Nivare, we see that on the one hand, there is a bit of like, I guess, I don't want to call it greed, but like he's very much made like a sort of lordly life for himself. He's acquired many feeders. He's built up this like almost palace out of Lysana's old lodge for himself, which seems to be a standard Great One move. I mean, look at Kinrove. Like, I believe Kinrove when he says that what he does because he thinks it's for the greater good. But he also built himself a palace. That part's not for the greater good. He just views that as his due as a great man. And it seems that a lot of the great men and women seem to just view luxury and wealth as essentially owed to them because of the role they play. Which is a lot better than Garnian society, because Garnian lords and ladies view their wealth as owed to them based on nothing. At least the great ones actually are an extremely valuable part of this society, unlike the ruling classes of Garnia. Just a thought. But either way, what we also see is that Soldier's Boy kind of needs Nivare. It's not made explicit here whether Nivare was allowed on purpose by Soldier's Boy to emerge from the box, or whether Soldier's Boy just kind of forgot about him after a while. But I think that Soldier's Boy brought Nivare back on purpose, because it's made very clear very quickly that Soldier's Boy while he might have the, like, strictly speaking, the memories of Navarre, um, he doesn't have Navarre's experiences. Uh, and more importantly, I think Soldier's Boy doesn't have Navarre's memories from the time they were separated. And that period is specifically the period during which Navarre was at the academy. So the specific thing that Soldier's Boy lacks from Navarre is the very thing he is now trying to use, which is military knowledge and experience. Um, so that's something that Navarre can sort of give to Soldier's Boy. Although, of course, Navarre doesn't want to. Um, and this whole section after Navarre is brought back, well, actually, the first thing that happens after Navarre is brought back is that Soldier's Boy orders the dance to resume briefly. Um, and Daisy tells him that uh, his own clan is next to be called to the dance. And as soon as this happened, I was like, okay, obviously it's gonna take Likari. Like, come on. I've read a story before. Like, that was kind of not much of a plot twist. As soon as it was established that they're doing one last round of dance summonings and it's gonna be from their clan, yeah, obviously it's gonna take the person that Soldier's Boy loves the most. Duh. um, but what I find interesting about this is that there is some ambiguity around why that happened. You see, we have three potential supernatural actors at play here who might have influenced the choice of Likari as one of the dancers. The most obvious is the one that Daisy and Soldier's Boy themselves seem to believe, which is Kinrove. Um, they both seem to believe that Kinrove essentially did this as a sort of poetic justice to punish Soldier's Boy, um, to make him feel some of the pain that the other specs feel or something. Um, which is certainly plausible, but I'm not entirely sold on the idea that Kinrove can sort of cherry pick who gets called to the dance. And the reason I'm not sold on that is because, based on everything we've seen so far, that's not really how the magic works. The magic in this setting doesn't seem to allow for that level of fine control. It's more about setting processes in motion and then letting them play out and maybe influencing how they play out. But I just don't feel like the magic as it's been established would allow a person like someone like Kinrove to hand pick the people who get called for the dance. Um, the other option is the magic itself, because the magic itself is seemingly sentient and it plays the long game. Like it works through a process of very long-term causality and cause and effect. And it's entirely possible that the magic, as a sort of almost author surrogate, maybe, sort of a self insert for Hobb herself, uh, is placing the pieces on the chessboard where they need to be in order for a certain outcome to become inevitable. And maybe doing this, taking Likari, is going to lead Soldier's Boy to make some decisions that will ultimately be necessary to reach the desired outcome. And of course, the third option is Orangela. And I'm pretty sure Navarre thinks it's Orangela. Like, I think Soldier's Boy thinks it's Kinrove, but I think Navarre thinks it was Orangela. Um, because Orangela did sort of suggest that Likari's life slash death would be the price that Soldier's Boy slash Navarre would have to pay. Um, and I think this might be Orangela taking his toll? Maybe? On the one hand, that seems like the most obvious answer, especially since Sorangela manifests as a bird right as it's happening. On the other hand, it feels a bit early in the book for Nevare's debt to be resolved. I feel like Nevare is gonna have to. I feel like the debt to Orangela is gonna be like the last thing in the book that gets resolved. Like that's gonna be somehow the climax of the story. At least to me, that's how it seems. Um, but either way, Likari gets taken. Olikea is absolutely broken because her mother was also taken by the dance. And here we get a bit more insight into Olikea and the fact that the way she treats Likari is not necessarily representative of spec parent-child relations. Instead, she's just keeping him at a distance to protect herself. Which is an interesting insight into her character and not one I predicted. It adds some depth to her, although it does also sort of root her more firmly in sort of, I guess, stereotypically feminine attributes like being very motherly and loving. I don't know. On some level, I kind of liked having a female character who wasn't at all motivated by her love and care for others, because that's something we so rarely see in fiction. Like a genuinely selfish female character who isn't a villain. But, oh well. I mean, most of her motivations are still fairly selfish, I think. Like, I do think that she is still fairly self-interested, but I'm just not sure how I feel about this extra level of depth being given to her here. Like, is this in service of her character? I don't know. But anyway, that's very much irrelevant. What's important is that this event kind of pushes Soldier's Boy and Nevare to be more willing to work together. And what I mean by that is they still vehemently disagree on what needs to be done. Nevare still obviously opposes the plan to genocide Geddes, not just because there's a bunch of random civilians there who will die, but also because Epini, Spink, and Amzil are all there, and their children. And I think for fairly obvious reasons, Nevare doesn't love the idea of slaughtering them. So I hope that won't come to pass. But he is also very attached to Likari. Like, he does love Likari, and care about him and want him back, I think. Maybe not as much as Soldier's Boy, but certainly he is also invested in saving this child. So I think this is sort of an important moment for Nevare and Soldier's Boy to start working together, which maybe works in favor of the theory that it was the magic itself that chose Likari, because it's the push that these two needed to start working together more. I'm not sure. We'll see. That's sort of, I guess maybe that's my working theory right now, that this was done specifically by the magic to push these two together. But speaking of things the magic makes people do, there is a scene here where Nevare and Soldier's Boy go to visit Lysana in her dreams. And Soldier's Boy has a conversation with Lysana where he drops a goddamn bombshell that Nevare does not take notice of at all. Like, Nevare is completely distracted by worrying about what Soldier's Boy is going to do, which Understandable given the circumstances, but I stopped paying attention to everything else when this happened, because Soldier's Boy talks to Lysana about the things that he explicitly felt the magic ordering him to do. And he says there were only 3 times when he had clear and explicit instructions from the magic. And those were, he says, everything that it asked me to do, I accomplished. I gave the rock, I stopped the spindle, I kept and left the book. So, spindle, obvious, we already knew that. We actually already knew that that was one of the things the magic told him to do. He'd confirmed that before. But I gave the rock? You mean to Colder? Colder Steet is gonna be like one of the 3 most important things that Nivare has done according to the magic is give that rock to Colder? I I have no idea how that's going to play out. I cannot wait to see the outcome of that. The other thing is, I kept and left the book. Obviously, that refers to the Soldier Son journal that Nivare kept. So, I now recall that Nivare often said that he didn't understand why he was motivated to keeping the journal even after everything that happened. I guess that was Soldier's Boy pushing him to do so in the name of the magic. This, I can see more clearly sort of the shape of where the story is heading with this, because I imagine that probably whatever resolution is ultimately reached between Gernia and the Specs might rely on some powerful person, maybe the Queen, getting a hold of and reading that journal and sort of maybe being motivated to stop the road based on that. That's the only thing that occurs to me. Because Apini did at one point suggest sending the journal to the capital. Yeah, that would be my guess for what's up with the journal. But the rock is the thing that's driving me insane. What has Colder got to do with this? What are you talking about? Now, there's one last thing I wanted to talk about in this whole section, and that is the revelation that Soldier's Boy does view himself as coming from Gernia. He doesn't view himself as starting to exist the moment Lysana created him. He views Nivare's life up to the age of 15 as equally his as it is Nivare's, which is fair. I mean, they are sort of equal parts of one whole that were split at that point. So everything up until that point was shared. So Soldier's Boy doesn't think of himself as a speck who is sort of trapped in a Gernian body, as it were. He views himself as someone who was actively rejected by Gernian society. Not as himself, but as Nivare. He says to Nivare, at one point Nivare asks him, do you not have any loyalty left to Gernia? How can you do this? And to which Soldier's Boy replies, do you think I don't recall Father and his discipline and endless requirements? Locked from the instant I drew breath into being his soldier's son, separated from all else so that he might convince me it was the only thing I could be? How could anyone forget that? How do you manage to forget it? Why are you still his puppet, still the obedient little soldier that your people made you to be? You say you do not understand me because I look at what was done to me and resent it. I cannot understand you because it seems all you long for is to return to that servitude. You would be the game piece of a king who has never seen your face, no matter what injustice or abomination you must commit in his name. And that is That was such a moment of catharsis for me because that's how I feel about Nevare's life. This whole time, I basically since the very beginning of the first book, I've been screaming that Nevare is growing up in an abusive environment, both in terms of his family and in terms of how his culture as a whole treats its members. Like, no Giernian is happy, and that's obviously because Giernian culture is sort of very explicitly based on a sort of puritanical Christian worldview, and Christianity is like the religion of being miserable. Uh, so obviously this culture is fucking miserable for everyone who lives in it, largely due to the religion, let's be honest. Like the religion of the good God, much like Christianity, is primarily just a way for people to oppress themselves and be oppressed by society at large. Um, which is actually kind of unique about Christianity. That's not a universal role that religion plays in societies. Um, as we see in this story, in fact, with the Spec religion and the Old Gods religion and so forth. Uh, and I think this sort of pushes Nevare to view his life in a different light. He realizes that Soldier's Boy isn't some kind of artificial creation. Soldier's Boy has a perfectly reasonable and normal set of conclusions that he reached in perfectly rational ways from the same experiences that Nevare had. Uh, because their experiences weren't split, only their personalities were. So essentially, what we see here is how two different people react to living the same life. They're both reaching, for perfectly understandable reasons, opposite conclusions based on the same set of experiences, which I think is really interesting and not something you see very often. But this sort of leads us to after the boxing. Nevare has this moment when he wakes up back to his senses, where he suddenly sees the physicality of both Specs and Giernians from a Spec perspective. So he says, the Specs saw the lean, muscled folk of Geddes as the result of hardship and unnatural strife. Such bodies were the result of people who lived against the world rather than with it. They did not relax and accept the bounty the world offered them. They did not recline with one another in the evenings, making music or having soft talk. They constrained their deprived bodies with restrictive clothing and tight belts and snug shoes, and punished themselves with endless activity. They seemed to rejoice in the harshness of life, restricting themselves from the enjoyment of food, sex, and plenty, as if in reaction to the stinginess they inflicted on their bodies, they demanded largesse everywhere else. They built roads to enrich themselves, to be sure, but did they ever enjoy the riches they secured? No. It appeared suddenly that riches only became the foundation for seeking ever more difficult tasks, and often on the backs of those that life had not favored. What is being described here? And I'm going to sound like such a nerd for saying this, but what is being described here is Max Weber's thesis on the ties between the Protestant ethic and capitalism. Essentially, what is being said here is that this combination of religious ethics that are at play here, namely the belief in sort of in sort of always working hard, and sort of life is it's sloth is sinful. Like, it's sinful to ever not be working hard and not be uh, making something new or advancing or creating more wealth for yourself or more prosperity or so forth. But on the other hand, it's also deeply sinful to ever really enjoy the products of that labor. Instead, you're supposed to just keep working for more without ever stopping to enjoy the products. Um, and Weber wrote that this essentially is that this cocktail of beliefs within Protestantism, especially Lutheranism, uh, set the stage for the creation of capitalism. Because capitalism has an infinite growth mindset. Capitalism has to always keep expanding, keep growing, keep making more profits. But it also doesn't leave any room for people to enjoy those profits because you have to keep working. You can't take a break and enjoy the money you've made because you need to go back to work tomorrow and the day after and the day after until you die. Um, so while Guernia isn't actually a capitalist society yet, it hasn't reached that point of development, it's getting close. And I think what we're seeing here is the roots of that. We are seeing the beginnings of capitalism among Guernians. And in a way, the death knell of feudalism. It's still very much a feudal society, but I don't think it will be much longer. I think now that I'm thinking about it, I think the new lords, the people like Navarre's father, are kind of the death knell of feudalism. The idea that now people who weren't necessarily born to be lords are starting to believe that maybe they should be earning lordships of their own. And I think it's a very quick path from that to believing that maybe no one should be lords by birth anyway. Uh, and then you see the rise of the mercantile class and the first capitalists and so forth. I'm getting way ahead of myself here, but what I'm saying is, by contrasting Guernian society with Spec society, this paragraph is one of the best illustrations of that concept I've seen. Um, Hell, it made me understand elements of Weber's work that I didn't understand previously, and I've read Weber multiple times. Um, yeah, I guess I'm gonna end on that bizarre note, which is that uh, this is now no longer a novel. This is a work of sociological theory. Uh, Thank you for that, Robin Hobb, I guess. Um, and also a work of sociological theory that shows a masterful understanding of sociology and how these things work. And also a criticism of Christianity. But I think the books were fairly openly that for a while now. I am curious to see how far that particular thread will go. I'm wondering how radical Hobb will end up being in her conclusion. Um, yeah, I guess, man, I've gone on long enough. I will see you all next time, where, hopefully a genocide will be averted? I don't have a lot of hope for that, but hope never dies, I guess. Yay! Please don't kill a Penny. I don't care about Spink and Amzil. You can kill them, but please don't kill a Penny. I like her. I'm scared. Bye.